Well, for starters, there is a distinct possibility that Ukraine could be exterminated. Again, I don't know if that's a high probability, low probability event. If one considers Putin's remarks, one might conclude that it's a high probability event. But the point is, it's at least a thinkable outcome that Ukraine, as not just as a state, but Ukraine as a country and Ukrainians as a people might actually be exterminated. This is something that I don't think any of us consider this in our lifetimes. It was obviously something that Ukrainians faced during the Holodomor. It was obviously something Ukrainians faced during World War II. But as far as we were concerned, it was either promoting human rights and trying to free political prisoners during the Soviet period. And since then, it's all been about, rule of law, democracy, market economy, corruption, things of that sort. And the assumption was that some kind of Ukraine would exist forever, so to speak. And the question was, how do we improve it? How do we make it better? How do we make it function more efficiently? And now we're facing an existential crisis, whereby it is at least, as I said, it is at least thinkable that Putin could commit genocide and could actually eradicate this country from the map of the world. I think all of us are shocked by that. Then secondly, obviously the mere fact, disregarding the fact that it's obviously of emotional concern for us, but this is a war, and it's the largest land war in Europe, as everybody says, since 1945, since the conclusion of World War II. This is, again, it's an enormous event for the Europeans. I think they were even more shocked than most Ukrainians were, because we never had too many illusions about Putin, but they probably did. But this, of course, is a game changer. Suddenly, all of the rules that seem to apply to Europe and Europe's relations with the rest of the world no longer seem to apply. You weren't supposed to just attack for no reason, for no manifest reason. And certainly you weren't supposed to do that in the heart of Europe. So this again is a problem because, of course, now the Europeans, as well as the Americans and of course the Canadians, have to rethink the rules regarding war, regarding peace, regarding international relations. I mean, is this the new normal? That countries can simply invade for whatever reason they choose to exhibit, especially in places that prided themselves on maintaining the peace, such as North America and Europe. Will this become the new normal? And of course, it's terrifying for everybody to consider. And unsurprisingly, it's even affected the thick skulls of the Germans, who until recently couldn't possibly have said anything negative about Russia or Putin. But now, as you know, they're actually supplying Ukraine with weapons. And just today, they've agreed to supply Ukraine with even more weapons, anti-aircraft weapons. I mean, this is an enormous landmark watershed event. I mean, it's hard to imagine what to call it. A country that had always prided itself on its pacifism and its friendliness towards the Russian neighbor is now arming Ukraine against the predations of this Russian neighbor. So that too changes everything. And of course, the larger calculation is how will this change the standing of Russia in the world? Until now, it more or less prided itself on being, well, if not exactly a superpower, then at least the third great power following the US and China. Does the war mean that Russia will become stronger? Well, that's certainly what Mr. Putin seems to think. In reality, as we probably know, the war will make Russia significantly weaker. It already is weaker than it was just 2 weeks ago, thanks to the sanctions, thanks to the oncoming economic collapse, thanks to Russia's transformation into a rogue state, into a pariah. All of these things are not going to make Russia stronger, they're going to make Russia weaker. How will that affect the Russo-Chinese alliance? because that, of course, was premised on a strong Russia that had complementary economic interests to those of a strong China. Will China want to partner with a country that just blithely invades its neighbors? If it can invade Ukraine, why not Mongolia? You know, I mean, I'm sure that's occurred to some Chinese. And again, I'm not saying that the Russians will do this. It's just that it's at least, now it's a plausible possibility. It's a plausible scenario. So will the Chinese retain this partnership? What's the attraction to the Chinese of remaining bound in some ways to this man called Putin, who seems to have lost his marbles in the process of attacking Ukraine? And then, of course, there's the question of the United States. Where does this put the United States? I mean, thus far, the European alliance with the Americans has been solidified as a result of the crisis. NATO has definitely become stronger. There's even talk of Sweden and Finland joining NATO. How will this affect Russia? Well, again, in no positive way, because Russia now faces a greater threat to itself than it did before this invasion. Ostensibly, its goal was to stop NATO, and Putin has done the exact opposite. He's galvanized NATO in a way that NATO would never have been able to galvanize itself on its own. So how will the Americans react? And of course, how will the civilized world react? I mean, are we talking about a new Cold War? And arguably, there's been one for the last 20 years, ever since Putin came to power. But we could be talking about the erection of a new Iron Curtain. Again, not so much by us, partly by the West, but mostly by the Russians. A kind of isolated fortress Russia mentality, which would presumably lead to a full-fledged fascist regime, possible other adventures in the so-called near abroad. Of course, it could also have the very opposite effect, because Putin, for all his supposed wisdom, I mean, he's always touted as being a grandmaster in chess, seems to be playing like a 4-year-old who's never seen the board. I mean, he's making mistake after mistake, at least from the point of view of Russia's objective interests. And it's perfectly possible that Russia and Putin could collapse. I mean, again, we would talk about that scenario as a remote possibility. Some of us believed in it more than others, but it was always a kind of on the back burner remote possibility. Now, Russians and Americans and Europeans are at least raising the issue that this might lead to Putin's end. And of course, one can easily then imagine that if, you know, depending on the circumstances of Putin's end, if there's a people power revolution, if there's a power struggle within the elite, I mean, there are too many imponderables, but one can easily imagine a situation where a civil war breaks out between proponents and opponents of Putin, which could lead to all sorts of awful consequences. I mean, you know, not the least of those would be the possibility of Russia's collapse, and all of what that could potentially mean for Russia, Eurasia, Europe, Ukraine, and everybody else. So the future kind of looks bleak, but there are some hopeful signs. I wouldn't be completely pessimistic. But in general, you know, the war has unleashed forces that will be difficult to tame. They are, in principle, tameable, but the world has changed, and it's become a far worse place than it was just 2 weeks ago. We've seen that in the last few days. They are obviously willing to supply monetary assistance. They've adopted some extremely painful sanctions. I mean, who would have thought that the Germans would ever agree to closing down Nord Stream 2? They've essentially brought about the collapse of the ruble. They've hampered the Russian central bank. And it's now, I've seen estimates that inflation will increase. One estimate was 30 to 40%. The other was 70 to 80%. I've seen 2 other estimates suggesting that Russian GDP could fall by 5%. The other one said by 10%. So, you know, those are guesstimates at this point in time, but clearly the sanctions will have an enormous impact on the Russian economy and on everyday Russians. That's very important. So we've got the monetary assistance, we've got diplomatic and political, recognition, assistance, and of course we've got economic assistance. Last but not least, virtually every country in Europe is providing some kind of military assistance to Ukraine, even Luxembourg. I mean, it's simply, and Switzerland and Sweden, both of which are technically neutral countries, and yet they've actually violated their neutrality because they realize Ukraine is important. So that's enormous. What Ukraine wants, in addition to that, of course, is a no-fly zone. That's highly unlikely to take place. I mean, again, one could imagine a worsening of circumstances that could lead to that, but at this point in time, I'd say it's highly unlikely. Well, the reason is very simple, because it would require taking action if the no-fly zone is violated by Russian airplanes, jet fighters, and of course, missiles. Which would mean that if there's a no-fly zone, someone, let's call it the United States or the collective West, would be shooting down Russian planes. That then would very quickly lead to, could conceivably lead to retaliation by the Russians. They might start shooting down our planes. And then before you know it, the situation escalates, and we are then in World War III. And no one wants that. And of course, that's of no use to Ukraine as well. And of course, given the deranged condition of Putin's mind, it is more than possible, let's call it moderately possible, that he would resort to nuclear weapons. Maybe just tactical weapons, but it's not impossible for him to start using strategic weapons. And that would mean that New York, Washington, Ottawa, Toronto would be targeted just as would be targeted. So nobody wants that. That's the major fear. Well, that's the alternative that Ukraine has just started pursuing. I read this yesterday. I think it was Minister of Foreign Affairs Kuleba, who said, but in any case, Ukraine in general. Now they're asking for anti-aircraft missiles, right? And not just Stingers, which are good for helicopters and things like that, but actual anti-aircraft and so on. In Ukraine, it's protipovitriana oborona, right? That is probably far more likely because it doesn't entail Americans shooting at Russians. It would just be a ratcheting up of the level of military supplies. I mean, you know, the United States and the West in general have provided Ukraine with Stingers, have provided Ukraine with javelins and other similar kinds of weapons systems. And this would, in effect, be, you know, similar to what they have. It wouldn't be kind of breaking the mold. And that, I think, could conceivably happen, and indeed may happen. I mean, we'll see, but I mean, that I think has a chance, a far better chance of taking place than an actual no-fly zone. All of us expected sanctions and, you know, the usual kind of diplomatic hand-wringing and condemnations and things like that. But this is just, you know, several orders of magnitude greater. But it's also reflective of the fact that Putin has committed an enormous, well, a crime, quite simply. It's a war crime. I mean, the very war is a war crime. It was completely unprovoked. It was so utterly massive. And of course, increasingly, it's resulting in civilian casualties. So it's become, you know, practically impossible for someone to stay indifferent to this ongoing tragedy. You know, the one silver lining in this ongoing tragedy is that it has persuaded the world that Russians and Ukrainians are not the same. And then the other far larger one is that it's persuaded Ukrainians that they are not Russians. As a matter of fact, as you know from the slogans that have been appearing in Ukraine, it's not just that they're not Russians, they've actually come to detest the Russians. I mean, the Russians are the enemy. And, you know, so from that point of view, the war is having an incredible nation-building effect. Of course, the tragedy is that we don't know how much of that nation will survive. If Putin embarks on his mad schemes and commits genocide, and if the ethnic cleansing leading to the refugees continues, it's conceivable that there may only be 5 or 10 million Ukrainians left. It should. I mean, the short answer is it should, because clearly we're seeing a repetition in many respects today of what transpired in Western Ukraine with the UPA in the 1940s and especially in the late 40s, early 50s. And we can, sort of let's call it a semi-objective, semi-neutral observer would see that the response on the part of Ukrainians to take up arms, throw Molotov cocktails, engage in sabotage, defend their country, sometimes, viciously. I'm sure that vicious attacks have taken place as well on the part of Ukrainians. The growing indifference that all of us feel to the casualties. I look at the number of dead Russians, and in the past I would have said, oh my God, how terrible. And nowadays I say, oh, good, it's rising. And I suspect many of us feel exactly the same way. And it's somewhat disturbing, but again, it's just kind of natural given the fact that your nation, that your people is on the verge of extermination. So if you can appreciate that circumstances drive people to take up arms and engage in an insurgency, and that those circumstances entail oppression, repression, extermination by a country or a people that regards you as their enemy, and not they. It's not that we hated the Russians, Russians hate us. Well, anyway, so if you consider all of that, put it all together, you should be able to conclude that despite the fact that the Ukrainian nationalists did indeed commit atrocities and did some bad things, yes, of course, but overall they were responding to Polish, German, and Soviet oppression. And they were responding in the manner that many national liberation movements throughout the world respond, that is to say, by means of violence. Again, I don't condone violence, if only because I'm more of a coward than anything else. But at the same time, I understand why people resort to violence under various circumstances. It's the only way you can defend yourself against a dictatorial exterminationist regime, whether that of the Nazis or that of the Soviets. Now, will those historians, again, I won't mention names, but they're known to everybody, will they see the light and perhaps come to a reevaluation? My guess is the answer is probably no, because they're just too much invested in their views. They spent the last 20, 30 years arguing that nothing motivated the nationalists other than some kind of crazy ideology, which is nonsense. It's nonsense even for someone who knows nothing about history. And having invested this much, it would be a real, they'd be taking a smack in the face. They'd be punching themselves in the face. And it would require real humility to say, well, maybe I overstated the case just a bit. And from what I've seen in the writings of these people, humility is the very last thing that characterizes them. So I don't see a difference taking place there. Where the difference will take place, and not may, but will take place, is amongst people, scholars, students who are only beginning to study the Ukrainian resistance during World War II, and who are evaluating the different perspectives. And they will be affected by what's going on in Ukraine today, and they are likely to use that as a point of comparison to the nationalists in World War II. And there I think there should be hope. And that will be, of course, that relates to Ukrainian Canadians, Ukrainian Americans, but also to Canadian Canadians and American Americans, because they've, of course, responded very positively to ongoing events. People genuinely do believe, and rightly so, that this is a heroic resistance. And once you said it's heroic, it will be very difficult to switch. I'm reminded, and I'll end on this comparison, I'm reminded of the way in which Americans thought of Poles. You may remember, you're roughly my age, you may remember that in the 60s and 50s and 70s even, Polish jokes were very popular. And then when solidarity erupted and almost overthrew communism and proved that the Poles were heroic, freedom-loving, the jokes stopped overnight. This is way before political correctness ever occurred. And I think something very similar has transpired in the minds of non-Ukrainians throughout the world. Well, remember, the military in the Soviet Union and Russia has never played an active political role. Well, behind the scenes, there, the generals are always active, but, can you think of a single putsch that was organized by the military in the last 200 years? And the answer is not really. And the military has stayed out for whatever reasons, partly because of Communist Party control, partly because of traditions. I mean, one could go down the list. But you do raise a very important point. And so let me just kind of backtrack a bit, and then I will answer it very specifically. We need to keep in mind, as you said, I mean, there were these mass demonstrations in 2011, mass demonstrations during Gorbachev's perestroika, and those encompassed virtually the entire country. We've had, just a year or two ago, remember, there were some 100 or 200 demonstrations that were organized primarily by young people throughout the country. Just 1-2 years ago, there was those mass demonstrations in Khabarovsk. Then, of course, we've got those mass demonstrations that were organized by the Belarusians. And, of course, no one in his or her right mind would have expected the Belarusians to do this. And yet, hundreds and thousands came out for several months. So clearly, and of course, I won't even go into the Ukrainian case, who've been demonstrating for the last 30 years. But clearly, it is possible for Eastern Slavs, Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians to express their discontent by engaging in mass demonstrations. And of course, specifically, that also applies to the Russians. So, the view that the Russians are incapable or unwilling, well, it certainly isn't true. I mean, historically, it just isn't true. It may be that many are not, but it certainly is true that many are. Which is sort of what you would expect in just about any country. What could tip the balance? Well, the sanctions will make a big difference, all right? Because 40%, 50, 60% inflation, lack of credit, bank runs, unemployment, possibly as high as 10%, economic collapse, that's going to hurt everybody. That's going to hurt everybody. And above all, it's going to hurt and be, or rather, that's not so much hurt, but it's going to be interpreted in potentially destabilizing ways by the professional middle class in Russia. Because these are the people who've gotten the most over the last 30 years, and these are the people who will lose the most. Because if you're impoverished, regardless of what the central bank does. These are the people with property, these are the people with higher educations, these are the people with higher professions and things of that sort. They will be struck very hard. And they, of course, are primarily located not in Pervomaisk or something like that. They're not in Omsk, Tomsk, right? They're the people who are in Moscow, right? They're the people who are in St. Petersburg. They travel, they wear jeans, they admire Western culture, they vacation in the Riviera, right? These are the people who are most inclined to be pro-Western and most inclined to be anti-Putin. And again, we know this from the past record of his, of demonstrations. And this group will become increasingly aggrieved. We know already that there has been an open letter that's been organized, I believe, by Lev Ponomaryov, that has been signed by over 1 million Russians. It's a letter protesting the war. There have been anywhere from 30 to 40 open letters written by intellectuals, artists, mountain climbers even, right? But all sorts of subgroups have signed and protested. There have been 2 Russian oligarchs that have protested, Deripaska and I believe it's Abramovich. Then, of course, Lukoil, of all places, has protested against the war, right? So there's a mood. The mood is growing, and the mood will continue to grow as the economic sanctions take hold, as the body bags come to return, right? All of that will have an impact. And as forces, as soldiers, as well as police and other forces are increasingly mobilized and sent to fight in Ukraine. I recently read that apparently Russia is mobilizing reservists. I've also seen again, I'm not sure if this is a rumor or a fact, but apparently there's been a reduction in the police force in Moscow because it seems that they're being drafted for work in Ukraine. None of these people are frontline first-class soldiers. You're Vanya, you're sitting, you're drinking vodka, and you're a reservist, and suddenly you're called to fight in the Donbass. I mean, this is hardly a pleasant outcome. Anyway, so you bring all these forces together, and there will be increasing discontent. There will be increasing dissatisfaction. And then what's key is what will set off the explosion. Because in these sorts of circumstances, it's almost always some particular thing. And that's hard to predict, or at least, I mean, it's impossible to predict, right? In Kazakhstan, just a few months ago, it was a price rise on diesel and fuel in general. And suddenly the Kazakhs are burning down their capital city and rioting throughout the entire country. In Belarus 2 years ago, it was the falsified elections, which led to this kind of, and the outrage that it produced. So in the case of Ukraine, it could be some atrocity committed by Putin. It could be a collapse of the stock market and everybody's savings are wiped out. It could be an attempt by someone to assassinate someone. And again, Russian versus Russian. It could be a crackdown by the police. Remember how Maidan began. Those students in December of 2013 were simply demonstrating peacefully. The police come out, they crack heads, blood is spilled, and the next day, 300,000 or 400,000 people march down the Khreshchatyk. And of course, that is highly likely because if one imagines the Russians will continue to go and demonstrate, sooner or later, something like that may happen. In 1905, the Tsarist troops fired on the innocent demonstrators in Petrograd who were simply asking for bread. And that led to, again, a series, again, it wasn't the only thing, obviously, but it clearly led to these sorts of events. Back in 1978 in Nicaragua, the spark that set off the revolution against Somoza was an earthquake, which he mishandled, and which then led to protests on the part of people because it revealed the corruption. Back in 1978 or 79, what set off the Iranian Revolution, you may recall this, it was a fire in a movie theater in Abadan, in which I think 200 or so people were killed, and the government seemed indifferent. That then led to those mass marches every 40 days. And then before you know it, millions of people are on the street demonstrating against the Shah. So something like that becomes increasingly possible. But as I said, it could be any number of those things. Sparks like that, triggers like that are simply impossible to predict. Well, and speaking of unintended consequences, one of the reasons why most people thought a war would not take place, or many people thought, I was one of them, by the way, was that, yes, and I thought Putin was bluffing. And the reason I thought he was bluffing, as did many of my friends, the reason we thought he was bluffing was because the war seemed senseless. We said, well, why would you invade? There will be sanctions, Nord Stream 2 will collapse, Russia will become a pariah, the Ukrainians will resist, it'll be a bloody slog at best, body bags will return, sanctions will be imposed, the economy will tank, and in what way does that give Russia any advantages? And in what way does that give Putin any advantages? Now, was he aware of that or not? I don't know. If he wasn't, then those were certainly unintended consequences of his action. My guess is that he figured, what we miscalculated is we didn't quite appreciate the extent of his animus, of his hatred of Ukrainians. And that's now become clear in retrospect. that the driving force here had nothing to do with NATO, has nothing to do with security for Russia. It's about eliminating Ukrainians. That's the driving force. And we didn't appreciate the intensity of this man's detestation of Ukraine, which is similar to Hitler's detestation and hatred of the Jews. And I just hope that the subsequent events don't lead in the same direction. Point, right? You know, one of the things that has, one of the forms of analyses that have become increasingly widespread in the last week is this question of Putin's mental condition. I mean, some people were always interested in that, but basically most people, like me, would have said, well, what's in it for Russia? What's in it for Putin? And you do a kind of cost-benefit analysis, and you say, well, there's no benefit, there are a ton of costs, it can't happen. And nowadays, of course, since it did happen, despite the fact that it still makes no sense, it really makes no sense, I mean, from anybody's point of view, then the only answer can possibly lie in his head. And of course, if it's in his head, then obviously worth suggesting or implying that he's not fully rational. Certainly not rational in the sense that we understand rationality. And remember the image of Putin as being a grandmaster, a guy who plays chess, and we're playing checkers. Well, if you play chess, you know that that's, sort of it's a hyper-rational game, right? It is the embodiment of rationality. And if Putin were indeed a grandmaster, he'd see that what he's done is embark on a losing game. It's as if he sacrificed his queen for a pawn. It just doesn't make any sense. Unless, of course, you make the assumption, as increasingly people are doing, that the guy is somewhat unhinged for whatever reason. I mean, maybe it was always a sickness. Some people have suggested that living in a bunker for 2 years in fear of COVID has kind of twisted his mind. Some people suggest that this hatred of Ukrainians that's been brewing has finally reached a boiling point. Who knows? Maybe it has something to do with his upbringing, with the diapers he wore. I mean, I don't know. But this has become a growth business. I mean, trying to figure out what Putin is and how he thinks and why he thinks as he thinks. But if you make the assumption that he's not rational and instead is driven primarily, if not exclusively, by emotions, fears, desires, these kinds of things, right? Sort of the opposite of rationality, then of course one could easily conclude that since one of his desires is to subjugate Ukrainians, that this enterprise, this war, actually makes perfect sense from his perverted point of view. Because yes, okay, so Russians are dying, maybe 10,000 have died, and we've lost 270 tanks, and we're losing, and people will demonstrate, and we're cracking heads, and the economy will tank, but who cares? Who cares if I can satisfy my main goal, my main desire, which is to subjugate and or exterminate Ukrainians? And if you think about it, that's really very similar to the way Hitler was acting, certainly during World War II. He would adopt policies that would continue the extermination of Germans, extermination of Jews, even though it was clear to everybody that they were hindering the war effort. But as far as he was concerned, war schmore. We win, we lose, as long as we kill the Jews. And Putin may have migrated into that kind of psychologically deranged terrain. But you're absolutely right. I mean, we could have 2 million Ukrainians in Canada and 2 million in Ukraine, and 2 million in the United States. Immediately, I mean, the primary concerns will be social, economic, right? I mean, where do you house them? How do you provide them with a living? How will all of that be done? And that, the burden will fall on the actual governments, but obviously Ukrainian aid programs will be established by the diaspora in order to promote some kind of well-being, some degree of integration and things of that sort. But it will be a challenge because the numbers will be phenomenal. I mean, this has never happened. In the case of the United States, The largest single immigration happened between 1890 and 1940, and it was roughly 300 to 500,000. And that was within 20 years, 20, 25 years. Here we're expecting an influx of 1 million possibly in a year, maybe even in a few weeks or days. So the enormity of the task will simply be very imposing. Eventually, of course, after the first couple of years, and let's assume people settle down, that will then begin to have an impact on the community in general. So clearly there will be more solidarity, I think, if only because people will want to help these poor people. There's probably going to be a greater sense of kind of national radicalization. We've all been very cautious about saying, we don't blame the Russians, we like the Russians, and that's likely to become a more difficult position to sustain. I think there will be a reevaluation of the nationalist movements. I mean, when even Zelensky says "Slava Ukraini, Heroyam Slava," and I was just watching a video of Ukrainian demonstrators in Melitopol, and they were singing the Ukrainian national anthem, and at the end they said "Slava Ukraini, Heroyam Slava," even though the conversations are all taking place in Russian, and then they say "Smert vorogam Ukraina." Well, that's likely to carry over, and it's likely to change certain attitudes within the scholarly field. It's certainly likely to change the attitudes within the Ukrainian community toward Russians. I think it will improve relations with Jews, and I think, Jews will now be very much welcome. I mean, they have been welcome within this new Ukrainian political identity, but I think, what this war has done will galvanize both Ukrainians to reach out to Jews and Jews to reach out to Ukrainians. And that may mean that sort of, the historical complexities of the past may be moved somewhat back because, of course, there is now an ongoing tragedy that affects ethnic Ukrainians and ethnic Jews identically. Everybody could be killed as a result of Putin's misadventures. And then within a few years after that, you need to expect that a lot of these kids who will now be living in Canada and the US, many of them will be interested in Ukrainian studies. Again, broadly or narrowly. And that may then have a very interesting impact on the existing or perhaps non-existing Ukrainian studies programs. I understand that CIUS has been having some difficulties in Edmonton, but if can you imagine if Edmonton gets an influx of 100,000 Ukrainians, that's going to change things very significantly. Right, let me just add a few words about NATO and the EU. Unfortunately, Ukrainians have had this obsession with NATO, and it hasn't helped. The reason being that everybody kind of knew, I know the Russians, even the Russians knew this, that Ukraine's chances of joining NATO in the next 20 years were pretty much nil. And then everybody also knew, and especially the Europeans, that even if Ukraine joined tomorrow and we're under attack, the European armies are in no condition to fight the Russians. I mean, they're underfunded, they haven't been trained, their equipment is old, the morale is low, their desire to fight a war is, infinitesimally small. So I would always ask people, can you really see Germans marching in Kharkiv? Can you see Dutch soldiers smoking weed in Poltava? I mean, again, it just boggles the mind. And then the last point that people always ignored is the famous Article 5, which obligates countries in NATO to regard an attack on one country as an attack on all. Unfortunately, that's where people stop reading Article 5, because it then goes on to say that the manner in which a country responds is determined by it. So there's no guarantee of a military response. So the Germans could organize a peace conference, the French could respond by organizing a march on the Champs-Élysées, and so on. There's just no guarantee of that. So as far as I was concerned, this desire of Ukraine to become a member, again, I understood it and I kind of supported it as a long-term goal, but it wasn't going to solve any problems, certainly not in the medium or short terms. And now, with the war, my guess is that Ukraine's chances of getting into NATO are even slimmer. Because, of course, that would mean that countries would have to make a decision about sending troops. Now, of course, Article 5 enables them not to make that decision, but some would consider it perhaps important to do so, others might not. And then, of course, there's the fear, as when we talked about no-fly zones, that bringing Ukraine into NATO could conceivably lead to even a greater Russian aggression and possibly a war of some kind, a world war. My sense has been, and I'm glad that Zelensky has been doing this, that the solution for Ukraine isn't NATO, for all the reasons that I just gave you. The solution for Ukraine is the European Union. And you know, Zelensky just recently he spoke with the European Parliament, and he asked for, more or less immediate accession, or at least the beginning of accession. That's realistic. Now, there are all sorts of bureaucratic hurdles that need to be overcome. And everybody has to be on board, and Ukraine has to make changes, and the Europeans. So it would still be a long slog. But under current conditions of war and the hostility of Russia, and the fact that the Europeans have suddenly awoken to the threat of Russia and have realized that something really needs to be done in order to stop Putin, finagling and accelerating the membership criteria for the EU is significantly easier than admitting Ukraine into NATO and possibly starting a war as a result. Because the Russians really can't object to the EU, not as much. I mean, of course, they wouldn't be happy, but it would be far more difficult for them to object. After all, it isn't a security alliance. It has no weapons. It's just an economic zone of cooperation and the like. And I think it's been a very smart move by Zelensky to focus on that, right? This is, again, it's not achievable tomorrow, but then again, remember, who would have thought that the Germans would deliver weapons to Ukraine? No one. Not a single German would have predicted that even 2 weeks ago. So, we're living in a fantastic time where suddenly everything, both good and bad, is possible. And it may not be impossible for Ukraine actually to make progress towards EU membership. This, of course, is assuming a kind of best-case scenario that Ukraine survives and is somehow or other able to get its house in order. And as we all know, that's still somewhat of a question mark. You look at what's happening at this point. The Ukrainians are holding off the Russians in the north and in the east. I mean, they've made some inroads, but it hasn't been significant. They're not holding them off as well in the south. That's a problem. So it all depends, obviously. It depends on what the Russians do, what we do. But my sense is that 4 weeks from now, if we have the same conversation, we will still have a Ukrainian army, and there will still be a Ukrainian state of some kind. It may be a little smaller, maybe a lot smaller, but I'm not so sure that that's necessarily going to happen, because the Russian army is having real problems, right? I mean, they are really suffering. I mean, the Ukrainians have really given them a major hit. And if these weapons deliveries continue, and if we continue shooting down planes and destroying tanks, and of course, if the Russians continue to have problems with fuel supplies and things like that, there's actually let's call it an even chance that Ukraine will be able to win Now notice, by the way, by winning, for Ukraine to win, it must not lose. For Russia to win, it needs to win, right? If Russia doesn't win, it loses. If we don't lose, we win. So the calculations are different. They need to achieve far more than we do. Obviously, if it's just a tiny little spot, if it's only Kyiv that survives, that's not going to be a victory of any kind. So it has to be a significant portion of Ukraine. But my guess is that'll happen, at least based on the last 10 days. I wasn't even thinking about that, but I think you're right. That would make sense. Because, Putin wants to destroy Ukrainians, physically and or spiritually. They've done this in the past. Why not do it at present? This is what the Taliban did. Remember? Right? You destroy all these historical records, and that way you destroy a nation because it won't have a memory, won't have a written memory. So that's actually perfectly possible. Will they destroy the St. Sophia Cathedral? Right? Remember, there was some talk of that. I'm inclined to think they won't, because they consider Kyiv, Gorod, it's the mother of Russian cities and so on. So they would say it's part of our historical heritage. On the other hand, they did destroy this church in Kharkiv,